you again. Hey. Right. So we made it to 2026. Who else is happy? That's what I thought. Now look, I love me a good graph, okay? Like this one from Storygraph. Very neat, very pretty, but it's also kind of boring, and it doesn't really convey much when it comes to what exactly my reading looked like. Not much substance. So consider it my entry as 2025 reading wrap-up, but I also don't feel like placing all the 45 books that I've read on tiers. It feels too organized, kind of goes against my whole online identity. I don't think that all the books that I've read left lasting enough of an impression to talk at length about them. I also don't read so many books that I can just comfortably pick top 10 best and worst ones. Also, I read Ukrainian books as well, obviously, and many of them are not translated into English. And while I'm all too eager to talk about those that I loved, I can do it just to gloat, just to be, nah, I can read this great book and you can't, sucks to be thee. But I don't see much point in dragging internationally Ukrainian books that didn't click with me for whatever reason, not even to give you an opportunity to make an informed choice, because there is no choice. Unless you learn Ukrainian, you're not gonna read those. So these are in the stats, but out of the discussion, because it just doesn't make sense to bring them up. Hence, what we're gonna do now is go through a list of very arbitrary nominations and cover the highlights of my 2025 reading year. And the first one is the wait, what? Of the year, or the book that has made me angrier since I've read and rated it the more I was thinking about it. And this is The Lost Bookshop by Evie Woods. So what it promised is there's this magical vanishing bookshop in Dublin, right, that appears in the lives of 3 characters who might need some magic to help them to go through whatever they're going through. Sounds amazing, and I bought it in this lovely chain bookstore located near Golden Gate in Kyiv, with a small terrace near the historical building known as the Baron's Castle. It's not a castle and there was no Baron. It's a bit of a long story, but it's a nice place which gave it a bit of a halo effect, and I really wanted to love it, and it positively refused to let me do so. First of all, the bookshop is barely there. It takes a lot of time for any of the characters even to get to it in the first place, and then they don't even spend that much time on page there. At some point, this is a mild spoiler, but I'm pretty sure it's in the trigger warnings. One of the characters gets wrongfully institutionalized in the first half of the 20th century. It obviously touches a very tragic part of history, I believe, particularly in Ireland, but I can't shake off a feeling that it was only done for timeline purposes, because when the character eventually escapes, it's done in the way that could basically happen much earlier. The main male character is a white lettuce who has no agency over his life, which does not stop him from cheating on his fiancée, of course, but he basically never loved her anyway, so that's okay, right? Right? A female character who is a domestic abuse survivor has gone to college, but she's so sheltered and unsocialized that she apparently doesn't know how libraries work. At the same time, she understands how to do academic research better than a guy who does it for a living, so go figure. Also, the book goes out of its way to explain how the magical bookshop came to be, but there are still some moments that don't make a smidge of sense if you think about them for more than 10 seconds. Apparently, the bookshop is so magical it can help one woman who is being attacked, but not the other, because the plot needs to happen, that's why. And the cherry on top, the main thing that made me the angrier the more I was thinking about it. Tell me why the best male romantic interest in this book is a Nazi soldier. I don't even care if it's a spoiler, by the way. I think people deserve to know. Yes, he's Austrian, he was drafted, he didn't have a choice, but I cannot spell out to you enough how hollow the "I didn't have a choice" excuse sounds for an invading soldier when you live in Ukraine. And that guy wasn't in infantry, he was a pilot. You're telling me he couldn't desert if he wanted to? And okay, he never believed in the Nazi ideology. He was taken captive. We'll just assume that he somehow went through war without causing any harm. Whatever, magical realism. But in the end, there is a stained glass in the bookshop commemorating him and his sweetheart, and it's described as a woman and a soldier. How do you know he's a soldier? Because he's wearing a uniform, right? What kind of a uniform, Evie? We're not doing this. We're not normalizing this. It's too soon, and it will always be too soon. Now I'm properly angry. Moving on. Did we read the same book of the year? The Familiar by Lipa Dugo. Look, guys, that's not even, oh, you're all wrong for not liking this book. No. Was it a 5 stars for me? Yes. Was it a very subjective 5 stars? Yes. I read it in the midst of a very grey winter in a very grey apartment where I was staying, and it gave me the vibrance of autumn Spain and the comforting ending that I needed. Do I think there was a part when this book could have been better? Yeah. Do I think people are wrong for not enjoying it as much as I did? No. It was marketed in a way that probably gave people wrong expectations, but it's also just not for everyone. But I need you guys stop mentioning vampires when you talk about this book, okay? I can swear I've heard it at least twice, and it's 2 times more than vampires are mentioned in this book. There are no vampires in the familiar. None. Nada. Stop trying to make me feel like I'm going insane. Guillen Santanhel isn't a vampire, he's a familiar. Your audience isn't dumb. You don't have to use the wrong word just to say he's supernatural and has a very long lifespan, okay? Let's criticize books on the basis of what is actually in them, please, and thank you. Moving on. What is the fuss about of the year? This one is for the books that I've heard about a lot before I finally got to reading them, and maybe I would be less motivated to read them if they were a little less hyped. First is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. To be completely honest with you, it was a part of a course that I enrolled in on literary theory, but I've been meaning to read it anyway, so I don't think it needs introduction. Basically, it's a classic at this point. A father and a son are traveling through post-apocalyptic America and observe the downfall of humanity. Okay. Right. I know there's also a movie, not sure if I'll find it in myself to watch it. Fairly enjoyed this one. I felt like the ending was a bit of a stretch. The tonal shift was notable, but it was okay and it made sense and I believed it. This book is more interesting if you place it in the context of when it was written in McCarthy's life, when he was thinking about the future of the world his son will live in, and in the history of the United States. It's the 2000s after 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina that showed the fragility of the human civilization as we know it. It's a thought-provoking read. I see why it is so popular and I think it's justified, and if you haven't read it, I think I can recommend it. Moving on. If We Were Villains by Emil Rio. I don't want to talk about this book too much because I've been boycotting Emil Rio. I talked about it in my October-November wrap-up. Don't want to repeat myself. I'll just say very briefly that it didn't really meet my expectations, which were as good as The Secret History. I'm pretty sure I've heard about it being compared to The Secret History more than once. It's not really there for me. I'm glad I've checked that box, but the hype seems overinflated. Moving on. The Girl with the Teddy Bear by Viktor Domontovich. This is a Ukrainian book written in the 1920s and recently picked up by Daedalus Books for English translation, which is scheduled to come out on January 30th. A poor scientist in post-war, recently overtaken by Bolsheviks Kiev in 1922, is hired by a new acquaintance to tutor his daughters. Of course, he starts a very obsessive affair with one of them, Zina, and of course she's the younger one, obviously. I believe she's 17 when they start seeing each other, so do with that what you will. But what looks on the surface is just an affair that can be quote-unquote fixed with marriage, which Zina's parents aren't really opposed to, by the way, in reality is an ideological clash that can't be truly mended. It reveals the change of times that everyone except Zina seems oblivious or in denial of. It's a rather slow psychological novel, very much of its time and very emblematic to what the literary scene in Ukraine of the 1920s looked like. So I'd been planning to read it for a while and I'm really glad I did, and if the literature of the period is of any interest to you, I highly recommend this one. Dress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. A fairly light story about a girl who never yearned for adventure, but it turns out she's really good at adventuring. I know this isn't very representative of what Sanderson writing mood looks like, but I wanted to read it for ages and I had some discount points in one of the local bookstore chains, so I used them buying this one, Mistborn, that is still unread, and Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, that I plan to reread at some point. I read Dress during summer, which is a perfect time for it, and I loved it. Very funny, very heartwarming, and generally a great time, featuring an extremely lovable main character. I'd say it's appropriately hyped and I'm eager to check out more of Sanderson when I get there. The "oh, I get it now" category for the books that I've heard great things about and now I understand why. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. That's magic realism done right, Evie Woods. Take notes. I've heard some contradicting opinions on this one, to be honest, but the ones that were good were stellar, and now I see why. Piranesi is the nickname given to the main character who lives in a very strange house. But if you ask him, the house is not strange, it's just full of wonders. And there are some skeletons, literal, but it's not like they're getting in the way. So when a book centers around one protagonist with few distractions, I think it wants to make them likable, and Piranesi is impossible to dislike. I loved being in his head. He's a bit naive and trusting, but he's not stupid. He's actually a scholar and a researcher. Thank you very much. As a jaded misanthrope myself, I actually do like me a character who sees the best in people, but not because he lacks the intellectual capacity to see otherwise. Because it's in the first person, the narration is also very idealistic, but it gives you hints that there's more to it than just a magical house with sea in it. I finished reading it in the bomb shelter during a Russian airstrike, and it's exactly the type of a book you want to read in such circumstances. It's not devoid of melancholy, but hopeful and full full of light, if you will. That is to say, I get it now. Also, if you learn one thing from this book, let it be this one. If somebody asks, does anyone know you're here? Your answer is always a resounding yes. The second in this category is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. At least one of my favorite booktubers spoke very highly about this book, and the description caught my attention. The youngest princess of a small kingdom embarks on a journey to help her sister out of an abusive marriage. This book is the case of family relations, namely mother-daughter and between sisters, depicted as not exactly idyllic and not downright toxic, but in all meanings of the word, complicated. I loved so much about this book. I can't quite remember why I didn't give it 5 stars. You want a romantic interest that is honorable and respectful? This book got you. You want a fierce older lady? How about more than one? You want an FMC who isn't a teenager? There you go. Absolute perfection as far as fairy tale reimaginings go, and a great way to introduce yourself to T. Kingfisher. I also listened to and enjoyed A Sorceress Comes to Call last year, but didn't love it as much as this one. Not sure why. Maybe Nettle and Bone just set a very high bar. I get it now. Next category is the journey of the year, or the series that I started or finished and want to talk about. I get easily intimidated by series, so it takes a lot of motivation to start one, and last year I started 2 and finished 1, and I feel like talking about 2 of them here. First is The Blade Itself from The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. I'm pretty sure everyone and their mother have heard about this one, but it's really hard to summarize. Basically, there is a bunch of very gritty characters who are ever so slowly assembling together to go and achieve something. Honestly, I can't remember if Bayaz's objective is defined in the first book or not. If anything, I had a lasting impression that the entire quest thing was less important than the characters. They all have very distinct personalities. What they have in common is that they are more compelling than they are likable. I have a Ukrainian translation of the second book, Before They Are Hanged, and I hope to get to it this year and maybe even finish the series, because so far the plot is too layered for me to hope to retain it all for a long enough time to understand where the third book picks up, so I guess I should probably just go through it all as fast as I can. Also, in 2025, I read second and third and final installments of The Grey Order Chronicles by Pavlo Dorovianko, and I had some feelings. Okay, I can translate it. I don't need to Google it. I don't need to look up my notes. The Snares of War and The Song of Awkwoods. I've posted on my Instagram about why I wish this series was translated globally, but I'll just briefly recap it here. It's a story about a fantasy version Ukraine that was capable to keep its independence in the 17th century thanks to the supernatural shapeshifting fighters who can turn into wolves and heal wounds, which is of course very helpful. 200 years later, a young protagonist, Severin, joins the order as it is going through some rough times. Again, I don't think these books are perfect. I feel like they needed some harsher editing, but I still first enjoyed them immensely, and second, think that this is a very important story for the themes that it discusses. Is it worth to give up your soul's peace to protect your land? Does anyone have the moral right to demand it of others? How much sacrifice is too much, and how much of the old order of things is worth preserving at all cost? It works in the way that when the plot is nearly over, the moral complexity of the story just starts to fully reveal itself, and when all is said and done, you have to answer many questions to yourself. Honestly, the more I talk about it, the less I care about its imperfections, and the more I wish more people could read it. What a ride. Next category is called I Didn't Know This Was Happening, because I literally didn't know something was happening.
I didn't know that was happening.
Let me explain. The first is Shadow of the Leviathan series by Robert Jackson Bennett, because somehow, even though I'm pretty sure I've read some biology-based fantasy back when I was younger, I think the Harvestide project by Oisin McGann counts as one. I wasn't aware of how biopunk can be. I was impressed by world building alone. The whole Sherlock and Watson variation was just another layer on top of that. I've listened to the 2 books of the series that are already out, and by all means, color me intrigued and do tell me more. The next is a bit of a mood shift. It's La Fiesta del Chivo, or The Feast of the Goat, by Mario Vargas Llosa, a bit fictionalized retelling of true events from the history of the Dominican Republic, covering the assassination of the dictator Rafael Trujillo in 1961 and its consequences. Basically, turns out killing the main big bad is not even half of the whole thing. I guess Disney lied to us. Of course, it's fiction, first and foremost, but with some additional reading, I've learned a bit of actual history that unsettlingly rhymes with modern reality. I would recommend this one. Just keep in mind, it gets dark things happened, and some of them are described here, so proceed with awareness. Okay, the next one. I did this to myself of the year. No surprises here. Monarch by Sophie Lark, an infuriatingly lazy book that I knew I would hate, and not because it's dark romance that doesn't say anything by itself, but because it exploits Ukrainian identity in the most egregious, tactless, and cowardly way. Sophie Lark mentions the Russian war against Ukraine the same way like ultra-prudish people mention, I don't know, periods. Very shyly, she doesn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, herself first and foremost. She doesn't even have the guts to make it a plot point. Instead, she decided to tell us about about how depressing Lviv is, as if we couldn't tell she wouldn't be able to find it at the map at a gunpoint. And the more time passes, the more pissed I get, because while Russians get to be represented by heated rivalry with hordes of unbombed fans gushing over it online, Ukrainians get this. At this point, writers, I beseech you, if you can't be bothered to treat a Ukrainian character with care and respect, just write about someone else. Anyway, I have an entire video about how much this book sucks. Go watch it. I'll stop myself here. I indeed did this to myself, didn't I? Okay, the It's Not You, It's Me category, or the DNF of the year, which is, and it pains me to say it, I promise it hurts me more than it hurts you, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Look, I know this is called classic. I've seen it being compared to Terry Pratchett, and I adore Terry Pratchett. I was listening to it in audio, and it was narrated by Stephen Fry. It doesn't get any better than this. I had about an hour left when I realized I just don't care, which is probably the worst thing you can say about a book. It's funny, it's imaginative, but I just realized if the main characters got brutally killed off in the next chapter, I wouldn't care a bit. Had I finished it, I'd have to give it a rating it objectively doesn't deserve. It is probably a great book and a great story for someone else. Literally, It's Not You, It's Me. Congratulations to everyone who loves it. God knows I wanted to be one of you. Maybe it's the audio format, not all books work in audio for me. Maybe I'll check the series one day. At this moment, I don't know. The comfort blanket of the year was easily The Secret of Ormdale series by Christina Bayer. I covered the first 3 parts of this 5-part series in my October-November wrap-up, and in December I read the remaining 2, City of Serpents and Valley of Dragons. I'll abstain from going deep into summaries, as that would spoil the previous installments, but it's pretty obvious from the title of the first book that Edith goes to London, where she makes some new dragon-keeping related connections, meets a mad scientist, don't look at me like that, this is late Victorian era, you saw that comment, that's not a spoiler, and maybe probably discovers some family lore. All of that intensifies in the 5th book, where we finally have our grand finale. Even though the final part takes place in autumn, the whole series feels like resting among trees in the park on a warm sunny day and listening to children laughing in the distance. It's very gentle, very funny, and even when it has to get dark, still very hopeful. If I had any notes, it would be that it's all in Edith's point of view, so we don't get a peek into other characters' heads, which, regardless of what you might have seen on bookish social media, is something some of us might want. Maybe I did want to spend a chapter with a side character as he's doing nothing of note. How do you know? In City of Serpents, there was a moment where it actually limited the story because so much was happening without Edith being present that it came sort of out of nowhere. I also read the short story from the series Januszek in Love, about probably my favorite character, and it gave me just what the series left me wanting, which was a POV different from Edith's. Also, fun fact, the last book and the short story feature a character from Ukraine, and even though the character herself is ethnically Jewish, not Ukrainian, and she's barely there, it still felt like a better representation than whatever cowardly slop Sophie Lark decided to bestow upon us. Oh great, now I'm angry all over again. Let's move on. The next category is Ukrainian books I read last year and I think you should know about. Not all of them are translated, that's why the category isn't called Books I Think You Should Read. There is A Land Beyond Perikop by Anastasia Levkova is a thorough and intimate dissection of Russia's slow reoccupation of Crimea through the eyes of the main character who grows up there, witnesses the Crimean Tatar national revival movement and Russian reactionary cultural policy, then followed by annexation and recolonization. It wasn't a pleasant reading experience, but it's supposed to be uncomfortable and enraging, so I'd say it did the job. I wish it was translated into English. Recently learned that it's being translated and published in Polish, so maybe one day. Next one is Daughter by Tamara Duda. In freshly independent Ukraine, a young girl is sent from a western town to Donetsk to live with her grandmother. There she comes of age, becomes an artist, builds her own business and her own little community, and watches it all burn to the ground in 2014 as Russia decides to liberate her from normal life, apparently. She also fights back to the best of her ability. Duda has been a volunteer for war effort herself. A volunteer is the one who raises funds and provides supplies to the military, not to confuse with volunteer fighters, so clearly her experience has influenced the novel. This is a gut-wrenching, heart-pulling story with a note of mysticism in it that is, in my experience, not uncommon for stories about Donbass and this war, and it has been translated into English, Czech, Latvian, Lithuanian, Macedonian, and Polish, so you can actually check this one out. It's a must-read for anyone who thinks that the Russian-Ukrainian war started in 2022, by the way. I already mentioned The Girl with a Teddy Bear. Read it, just don't say I didn't warn you about the creepy age gap, okay? In its defense, just in case it wasn't already clear, it is by no means a love story. Next one is Martians on Khreshchatyk by Vera Aheeva. I really wish it was translated, but I kinda see why it's not. It's a pretty niche nonfiction about the literary scene of central Ukraine in the 1920s. This is the time of a generation that will later become known as the Executed Renaissance, which I bet gives you a solid idea of how this all went down. There was a brief period in the early Soviet era when the communist regime was toying with the ideas of national revival, and the Ukrainian cultural elite made the best of it. New names emerged in the Ukrainian literature, some of them more sympathetic to the Soviet government than the others. Authors gathered in literary groups centered around different ideas of what the art of this new time was supposed to look like. The slogan "Away from Moscow," ascribed usually to Mykola Khmelyovy, even though he's not documented saying that, meant a strive to engage with the European literary tradition instead of being locked in with the Russian metropole. As you might have guessed already, it all ended with a wave of arrests, executions, and exiles. But Ahayeva focuses on that little sliver of time, portraying Ukrainian literary icons like Khmelyovy, Vinnichenko, Podmogilny, Simonenko as human beings of flesh and blood, and I just think it would be an enlightening journey for anyone interested in learning about Ukraine and Ukrainian literature more. Okay, let's briefly go over the honorable mentions of the year that got my 5 stars and have not been mentioned before. Vicious by V. Schwab, and The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Also Endling by Maria Reva that I gave 4 stars, but I think it deserves to be mentioned. All of these I read in the autumn and covered in my previous video, just giving them one more shout out. I'm not going to choose the best book of the year because I don't really feel like it would be a clean cut, but these 3 are the ones that will probably stay with me for quite some time. And I'll leave it at that. So these are my 2025 reading highlights. I'm very excited for the stuff I have in plans for 2026, provided of course that I'm still alive and my library doesn't get destroyed. That would definitely dampen the mood. But that's it from me. Thank you for listening. Enjoy your reading and you'll hear me when you hear me. Bye.